Hi, and welcome to the 73rd in our Middle Eastern history series. And today we're going to talk about modern Lebanon. We're going to talk about modern Lebanon today and next week. And we're going to take it from the point of independence, which is 1943. And hopefully today we'll get through the bulk of the Lebanese Civil War. That's sort of the plan. We'll see how well that goes, and then we'll cover the rest of Lebanese history next week. So the rules for those of you who may be unfamiliar: this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in religion, philosophy, history, or any of the subjects we will be covering. That said, I try to give this from a secular, non-biased perspective. But this, like every other presentation on Middle Eastern history, is going to be controversial. So let's be respectful of those differing opinions. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. If the question isn't appropriate for that moment, we'll handle it in the Q&A. And during the Q&A, if you want to raise your hand and speak, and that way we can have a conversation, I'm completely open to that, and that will be a lot of fun. What I like to say is that these presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you already know something on the topic, that's the 201. I'm going to give you something you didn't know. And if you don't know even the basics on the topic, don't worry, I'll get you there. I have a 2-hour hard stop, and what that means is that at 9 p.m. Eastern time, wherever I am in the presentation, that's where I'm going to stop. The next slides will roll over into the next week. When I put dates below a person, almost always they're going to be political figures, so those will be their years of service. If it's a thought leader or philosopher, the dates below will be how long they lived, since they didn't have an official position. This, like the other entries into the Middle Eastern Islamic History series and all of the things that we do in history, mostly ancient discussions, will be on our YouTube page. Please subscribe to our YouTube page, and you can view those recordings to see the trajectory in a more clear way. For example, if you wanted to go straight from episode 54 to this episode 73 and see the trajectory of Lebanon, that would absolutely be possible by going to our YouTube page. And if you want to be involved in the Zoom, if you want to be able to ask questions in real time, you want to be able to experience the presentation and everything that's going on, please join our meetup, so that way you can get notifications about when the next meetings are. They will be 7 p.m. on Wednesdays. And also, we have premium YouTube, premium meetup, and premium Zoom, which all have a premium. So we appreciate if you find this valuable, that you give us a few cents. If not, don't worry, we're still going to continue to provide these free of charge. But if you feel motivated, if you feel like this is contributing to your intellectual stimulation, if you feel like you're growing and developing, please show some love back to us. All right. So when we're going to talk about Lebanon, there are a couple points that I want to sort of put in our minds as things that we're going to be seeing throughout this story. The first thing is that Lebanon sits on one of the primary axes of the Arab Cold War. And we've discussed the Arab Cold War as an aside in a number of the other presentations we've done, but we've never formalized a discussion of it. So I'm going to do that here. The Arab Cold War was in many respects a fight between, on the one side, Western aligned monarchies, and on the other side, Arab socialist aligned republics. And we use the word republic understanding that it's usually not a democratic form of government, but that the ruler is a president as opposed to a king. And power is held usually by a military clique or by some coterie of elected officials, but not necessarily coherent political parties that oppose each other as they would in a normal democracy or democratic republic, small case d. So in the beginning of the Arab Cold War, we see a relationship develop between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and that's generally a positive relationship in the early part of the 1950s, because they see Jordan and Iraq as very pro-Western. Remember, Iraq was ruled by a monarch until 1958. Starting with the 1950s, we see a number of monarchies throughout the Middle East fall. Egypt falls in 1952, Iraq falls in 1958, Libya falls in 1970. All these monarchies that fall, in 1960, all these monarchies that fall end up giving way to these Arab socialist republics. Algeria becomes independent in 1962. That's another one. And so now Lebanon finds itself on the axis of those states and the states that tend to be more Western aligned. That's Jordan. Increasingly, by the end of the 1960s, Saudi Arabia becomes more Western aligned because the enemy of their enemy is their friend, right? Increasingly, they're afraid that the Egyptians are going to destabilize Saudi Arabia and Yemen, which are both monarchies, in favor of a republican form of government. And the Americans are in opposition to Nasser, the ruler of Egypt. So through that relationship, the Saudis reconcile with the Jordanians and begin to have a more formal alliance alongside the American side in the Cold War, and therefore they begin to push more towards those Western alignments. And Israel, of course, is Western aligned from day one. They're not going to have any sympathy from the Arab masses. Many of the kings were also opposed to the state of Israel, but because the republics claimed to represent the will of the people, regardless of whether they actually did or not, the anti-Israel sentiment was more naturally expressed by them. And there was much less deference in their government to the possibility of some kind of under-the-table negotiation. Jordan, for example, had under-the-table meetings with Israelis all throughout the period from Israel's independence in 1948 all the way until the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty in 1994, when those relations became on top of the table. So because Lebanon sits at this crux between the Western aligned states and the quasi-Soviet aligned republics, it's going to be directly affected by that conflict. And we're going to see that tearing apart at Lebanon, especially during the Civil War. Another key element that we want to discuss is that Lebanon, and it's related to the previous one, Lebanon is bordered by two much more powerful, in a militarily speaking way, nations, Israel and Syria. Both of them have much more advanced military technology, larger forces, larger underlying populations, and they have designs on what Lebanon could and should be. And we're going to discuss those as we move through the presentation. But we should keep that in mind, that Lebanon is almost constantly facing an existential threat from both Israel and from Syria on what Lebanon could be or should be. Another thing, and we're going to get much more in depth about this in a minute, Lebanon has a precarious balance in terms of its ethnic demography. And in the early days of Greater Lebanon, when the French created it in 1922, the population of Christians to Muslims was roughly equal, with Christians being slightly more. But these populations are not going to grow at the same rate. And combine that with a large-scale exodus of a lot of the Christians from Lebanon, these changing relationships between the Christian and Muslim demographics are going to result in different political aspirations for both of those groups. Another piece that I want to draw attention to is how divided Lebanon is in terms of its internal setup from a districting perspective. The way Lebanon existed during the Ottoman period is that you had a number of individuals called Za'im, and these Za'im, plural Za'ama, but these Za'im would be given a tract of land as almost a feudal lord, and the sharecroppers would be on their territory. This is very similar to what we talked about in Syria and this is very similar to what we talked about in other places in the Levant, that this was the strategy of Ottoman landholding. In particular, in Lebanon, these powerful Za'im families began to be instantiated from a political perspective because the Ottomans ruled through a very feudalistic style, which gave a significant degree of autonomy to the local leadership. So when Lebanon becomes a republic, a lot of these clans, because of their entrenched land ownings and wealth, effectively enter politics in the independent Republic of Lebanon. And so many of the families that we're going to talk about in this presentation are still in power. It's just their sons or their grandsons who've inherited the mantle from them. But the staying power of these families has a lot to do with the fact that they started the game of independent Lebanon in a much better position. And so when the Lebanese Civil War breaks out, what we end up seeing is that the territories of these clans, combined with what their individual militias are able to hold, results in Lebanon being a patchwork, much more so than a clear national government and a clear opposition or rebellion territory. In fact, the Lebanese Civil War is best understood as a four-way war with multiple individuals continually changing sides and deck chairs than it is something like the American Civil War, where you have one clear governmental side, one clear rebel side, and there's territories that are delimited and understood. It's much more confusing than that, and we're going to get into that. So one of the things that sort of sets up the relationship of medieval Lebanon, and we talked about this a lot in episode 26, is that Lebanon has a distinctly large population of Catholics. These Catholics are called Maronites, and a Maronite is simply a Catholic that follows the Syrian rite, meaning that they pray in the Syriac language, but they maintain union with the Holy See in the Vatican. Now, in the mountain, you had this large Maronite population, but the Ottoman sultans didn't want to make the Maronites, if they could, the actual owners of the land. They wanted to give that power to a different group, and so they entrusted the Druze with it. In particular, Fakhreddin Ma'an is probably the most famous founder of Lebanon in this sense. He was a Druze chieftain, and he was able to create his own support base by working together with the Maronites. And because of the Maronites being Catholic, Fakhreddin Ma'an was able to build relations with Europeans, especially the Grand Duke of Tuscany, in order to support his semi-autonomous state. And of course, eventually the Ottomans thought that he had too much power, he was overthrown, and he was replaced by somebody else. But this relationship between the Druze being the landholders and the Maronites being the sharecroppers on that land held for about 200 years. In fact, if we look at the Battle of Ain Dara, which I want to show for a few different reasons, the Druze remain the predominant force in both the Qaisi faction and the Yemeni faction. Both of these factions are made of Druze in their leadership positions, the Jublat of the Shuf, the Talhok of Gharb. A number of these are Druze, and of the Yemeni faction, the Alameddin, the Arslan, and the Sawaf are also Druze. And what we should understand here is that these were two sets of Druze feudal lords who are competing over territory and trying to expand their territory at the cost of other Druze feudal lords. And they would be assisted by other individuals who had a reason to fight in preservation of the territories that their lords were holding. For example, the Shihab at this point were a Sunni faction. They supported the Druze. I believe the Khazan clan of Kasirwan, I believe that they're Christian. and Maronite. And so you have these different groups that are fighting together. And so when people try to characterize, and I will as shorthand, unfortunately, that there is a Maronite side and a Sunni side and a Shiite side, we should understand that in many cases, that's not the way that it's actually functioning. There are different coalitions on either side, and these coalitions may dissipate after that battle or after a series of battles, and then rearrange the deck chairs and go after each other. And so while there may be generalities we can say about these different ethnic groups, it's much more important to understand this as a number of different tribes with different socioeconomic positions, and that these tribes are fighting out amongst each other in terms of the long-term survival of their feudalistic plots of land and their economic prosperity. So one of the interesting things about Lebanon is that it is the only Ottoman territory I'm familiar with where, for a significant period of time, it had a Christian ruler, and that's Bashir Shihab II. Now, I just got finished saying that the Shihab dynasty were Sunni Muslim, and they were in 1711, but a fraction of the family had converted to Maronism, converted to Catholicism, and became part of the Maronite Church. And Bashir Shihab was from that branch of the Shihab family. And his main competition was Ahmed al-Jazzar Pasha, who was the ruler in Damascus. So between the two of them, they were contesting lands that today form the eastern part of Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, and areas around there. And their fight, of course, if you look at the years that Bashir Shihab was in and out of power, those years coincide with Napoleon's invasion of the Levant, and they also coincide with the Egyptian invasion of the Levant. The first being in 1799 and the second being in 1832. And naturally, when these external forces came into areas that these individuals controlled, those external forces became incorporated into the fight that those two individuals were already engaged in. So when Napoleon came from the south, he was coming from what's today Israel, moving north towards Lebanon. He took the city of Tyre. He was fighting Ahmed al-Jazzar Pasha because Tyre was a city that he controlled and was not under the control of Bashir Shihab. So, of course, Bashir looked to be in alliance with the French because he didn't support his fellow Ottoman governor. He supported staying entirely outside of the conflict. On the flip side, when they went to war again, Ahmed al-Jazzar Pasha and Bashir Shihab in the 1830s, and the Egyptians requested the support of Bashir Shihab in terms of their northward advance, Bashir Shihab sent soldiers, mostly Maronite Christians, to join with Ibrahim Pasha's Egyptian Sunnis to besiege Damascus, where Ahmed al-Jazzar Pasha's successor was ruling at the time. So the lesson I want to sort of draw from this story, and we're going to see it also again as we move into modern Lebanon, is that in many cases, as much as we can talk about the external powers having designs on Lebanon, and we're definitely going to talk about that, we should also understand that the Lebanese have designs on their external interlopers. That the people who are coming into Lebanon and are looking for arrangements with the different militias inside of Lebanon, the different ethnic groups and feudal lords and territorialities, the Lebanese understand that these could tip the scales versus their local opponents and choose between different actions in order to secure their possible longevity. Now, Bashir Shihab bet on the wrong horse, not because the Egyptians couldn't defeat the Ottomans, they could. And in fact, it looked like they were going to until the British, Austrians, and Russians intervened on the Ottoman side against the Egyptians in order to preserve the status quo. And when the Ottomans retook the area, Bashir Shahab, of course, was ejected in 1840. So in order to keep that status quo that the British created in 1840, the British began to create a new relationship with the Druze of Mount Lebanon. Now, we've discussed how Mount Lebanon is almost exclusively Druze and Maronite. So by supporting the Druze, the British were creating an unequal situation for the Druze, who were already in the position of economic power and political power, but now they were at a position where they would also have superior military power. And so what we begin to see in 1860 is that a number of local internecine conflicts between the Druze and the Maronites bubbled up into an actual ethnic conflagration, with many Maronites fleeing to Damascus and other Maronites taking up arms to fight the Druze. And in many ways, this civil war was a microcosm of the civil war that would occur about 100 years later, in that you had different groups fighting over different pieces of territory. They organized into smaller militias. The overpowered government authority, the Ottoman Empire, stayed largely out of this. And so while it was technically occurring on Ottoman territory, it may well have been in Oklahoma for all the care that the Ottomans actually gave it. And in essence, it became a conflict between the British and the French, not directly, but through their chosen proxies in the conflict. And so the French began to aid the Maronites. The French had a long historic relationship with the Maronites because of the shared Catholic religion and the strong pro-French sympathies of many Maronites in terms of culture and discussion. We talked about a number of French Romantic theories that filtered into the Arab world through Lebanon because of this Francophilia. And so the system that we end up seeing that prevails in Lebanon at the end of the 19th century is a French-supported autonomous region within the Ottoman Empire. One of the arguments that we talked about with regards to the Armenian genocide in episode 43 was that many Muslims within the Ottoman Empire felt that Europeans were using the treatment of Christians as a way to leverage an advantage against the Ottoman Empire. And to a large extent, that is true. To another extent, Christians were also second-class citizens in most of the empire. In particular, the French used the situation of the Maronites and whatever suffering the Maronites may have undergone as a wedge against the Ottomans and their area of control. Now, I want to take a second and look at the map on the right-hand side, because this is an important clarification. If we look at that black dotted line that traces inside the area of Lebanon, mostly surrounding those red and blue areas, that is Mount Lebanon. So Mount Lebanon is not the entirety of the country. In fact, it's about half the size of the country. It excludes Beirut, but otherwise is most of the coastal region. And Mount Lebanon, as we can see, is almost entirely Maronite and Druze. There are some Sunni minorities, some Shiite minorities, but we're talking about over 75% of the population is Maronite. Once we look at all of Lebanon as it exists now, which is what's called Greater Lebanon, it includes significant purple and green areas, purple being Shiite, green being Sunni. And so we should understand that distinction when we talk about the expansion to Greater Lebanon. So as I mentioned, and you can sort of see it here, Mount Lebanon by 1899 was an autonomous region within the Ottoman Empire. It's there as that yellow sort of blob. It was a Kaza with significant degrees of independence relative to what the Ottomans were governing. And this was typical of a pre-modern state, that you could have this kind of devolved autonomy. And like every other place in the Middle East that we've talked about, there was certainly the discussion between different modernizing philosophies when we had the Nahda, or the Renaissance of thought and of ideas. And we talked about how there were sort of two paths that different countries took. You had the nationalists and the Muslim modernists. And almost to a T, Islamic modernism was absent from Lebanon. And we've spoken about, for example, Georgi Zaidan, who, if we use the term anachronistically, was Lebanese. He was Greek Orthodox, so he wasn't Maronite, but he was Christian. And he formulated the idea of Arab nationalism. And increasingly, what ended up developing from him is Syrian nationalism. But we also have ideas like those of Ghabat al-Haq, which is about the creation of almost a Christian modernist state, that the light of modernity is reflected in the love that Christianity bestows, and that those things can create a modern technological society that has a moral compass. You also have the Syrian nationalism of Anton Saadeh, where we have this idea that all of the Levant is truly one state. So that's Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. All of those territories should be one country, but it shouldn't be a country for all Arabs. It should be a Syrian country. And the dialect of Arabic spoken and made official should be the local dialects. It shouldn't be the standardized dialect of Arabic that we have in other areas of the Arab world, because there is a unique diversity and culture that exists in the Levant that's found nowhere else. And Lebanon also has a unique feature relative to most other Middle Eastern countries at the beginning of the 20th century, and that is that there was a significant Lebanese population in exile. We don't really see this for any of the other populations. There are certainly Egyptians and Syrians and Iraqis and Yemenis, especially Yemenis in London, for example, where there are a few hundred or a few thousand of these individuals in external communities. But the Al-Mahjar, or the diaspora for the Lebanese, is enormous and almost exclusively Christian for the bulk of its time. And so because of this, we have a relationship that develops between those Christians outside of Lebanon who still feel a connection to the country, and the country itself. So World War I comes along, and World War I doesn't affect Lebanon in the sense that it got invaded or that there are any battles that take place in Lebanon. It could be said that at the final end of General Allenby's march north through what is today Israel, he reaches Damascus, and there's probably some point at which he crossed Lebanese territory, or maybe took the city of Sidon or Tyre. But by and large, from a military perspective, we don't see anything happen in Lebanon. But what we do see is the Great Famine. And this is a huge event in the Maronite Christian psyche, because the famine happens in the mountain. So let's walk back a little bit what happened here. Historically, Lebanon and a number of the other feudalistic states were trying to do the most to maximize their wealth generation in order that they could buy the weapons to protect themselves from the other feudalistic warlords. In order to do this and create more prosperity, they generally planted cash crops. In particular, Mount Lebanon was known for silk making and the growing of silkworms. So you had a situation where the dominant crop of the area was one that is non-comestible. But it gets even worse than that. In 1916, there was a plague of locusts that descended upon much of the Levant and cut down its food supply tremendously. meaning that under normal conditions, there probably would have been a famine throughout the Levant and especially in Lebanon. But it gets even worse than that. The British began to blockade the Mediterranean against the Ottomans in order to gain a foothold in the southwest Levant, right in the area of Palestine. And by doing so, they prevented food shipments coming from Anatolia and from other areas in the Ottoman heartland from getting to the coastal regions. So the Ottoman soldiers made the explicit decision to prioritize their own survival over that of the local population. And that led to direct food theft, reacquisition, and forced starvation in the mountain. None of this was at all helped by the fact that the governor of the province, Ahmed Jamal Pasha, who is one of the three members of the CUP triumvirate, the three architects of both the Ottoman Empire's military decisions in World War I, as well as their decisions with regards to the Armenian, Assyrian, and Pontic Greek genocides, was no fan of Christians generally, and certainly didn't care about the Maronite civilian fatalities, considering that Maronites did not get conscripted into the Ottoman armed forces, and, generally speaking, were autonomous and pro-Western. And so of the 400,000 Maronites that entered World War I, 200,000 died of starvation during this great famine. And the 200,000 that survived were forever marked with the fear that extermination could come from them and could come for them. And the only people that they could truly trust to defend themselves were themselves. The West did not intervene to protect them. Their Ottoman guardians actually stole from them, and there was no recourse. One of the things that shows the importance that Lebanon held, at least in the Allies' conception of what should happen in the post-World War I Levant, is the Hussein McMahon correspondence. Now, of course, this correspondence is very famous because it's often brought up in contrast to the Balfour Declaration with regards to the State of Israel. But we don't need to look at the Balfour Declaration for the moment, because the territories that we're talking about aren't in conflict with the Balfour Declaration at all. In the Hussein McMahon correspondence, there is an explicit territory that is carved out of the future Arab state that would be given to Sharif Hussein of Mecca. And that area is from Mersina, Alexandretta, and to the areas lying west of Damascus, Hama, Homs, and Aleppo. And if you look on the map, on the right-hand side, you can see that this area includes most of what is today Lebanon, most of what is today the Syrian coastline, and portions of what is today Turkey's Hatay province. Now, it doesn't go all the way to Sidon or Tyre, which are part of Lebanon today, but most of that area west of Damascus would seem to be what they're talking about. And they're saying that those areas are not to be purely Arab, by which they mean that Mount Lebanon is there. And the Maronites were not considered as Arabs by the Westerners who had long-term relations with them. In their mind, they elided the concept of Arab and Muslim, so that if these were Christians, and they were, that they couldn't be Arabs. Whether or not Maronites are Arabs is certainly a heated discussion topic, and it depends entirely on how you define Arabness. There is no singular definition. Probably on the most extreme is the view of Saad al-Husri, and his view was that a person who speaks Arabic as his mother tongue is an Arab, regardless of any personal views he may hold on the matter. Then there are the views of a number of Lebanese that they are something else, be it Phoenicians, be it Canaanites, be it Crusader descendants, what have you, but they're not Arabs, despite the fact that they speak Arabic, because their mental consciousness is somewhat different. Now, it wouldn't be discussion about World War I if we didn't bring up Sykes-Picot. Given the French historical relationship with Lebanon, they pressed quite strongly that the area along the Levantine coast be assigned as part of the French zone of control, and the British were willing to concede that as long as they got the area around Palestine and Mesopotamia. Now, the French weren't able to hold on to all of the territories that in the Turkish War of Independence, some of the territories that France claimed, especially Cilicia, were forcibly ceded to the Turks after the Turkish War of Independence. And part of that meant that a number of Armenians that had been part of the French forces began to settle in Syria and also in Lebanon. And these Armenian communities have become a part of the Lebanese society, and they were absorbed to a greater degree because they were Christian and therefore amplified the number of Christians in the territory. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But there's a question here of, so you're saying there was a tension between ethnicities and religious affiliations, identities? Absolutely. So in Lebanon, religion has an almost ethnic character to it, right? So if a person is a Sunni Muslim, that is their ethnicity. But ethnicities are not singular. You can have multiple of them, depending on the parameter you're choosing. And so many of the Muslims in Lebanon identify as Arabs because they speak the same Arabic language and they feel a connection through the process of Syrian nationalism, right? That idea of greater Syria, of Syrian nationalism to other Arabs outside their borders. And so they take on that ascription of identity because of those two factors. The Maronites, especially, but there are other Christians who are 6 to 1, half a dozen to the other about this. It's very contentious. Argue that their ethnicity may or may not be Arab. They certainly speak Arab. They're not contesting that, as opposed to, for example, the Assyrians or the Armenians who have their own languages, or the Jews who have their own language. But the Maronites, because of their political aspirations and their sense of place relative to the West and to the East, they didn't see themselves necessarily as part of the Arab project. They were Lebanese. This was their home, and that wider sense didn't apply to them. And so they rejected the Arab label by and large because they didn't see it as, they didn't see themselves as being part of that wider mission. I hope that answers the question. And speaking of Greater Syria, you can see that the King Crane Commission, which was an American commission, it's one of the few times that Westerners have actually asked Middle Easterners, what do they want? And of course, the Americans proceeded to have little to no say in what actually happened because America during 1920 was incredibly isolationist. But the Americans actually asked Middle Easterners what they wanted. And if you look very closely, Syria is all united. And by Syria, I mean the entire Levant. But you can also see a small carve out for Mount Lebanon. The Lebanese did not want to be under the authority, or rather, I should say, the Maronites did not want to be under an authority that they could not trust. And they certainly could not trust an authority based in Damascus, or based in Aleppo, or based in Jerusalem, or any other city, based in Beirut even. Beirut is a Sunni majority city at this time. They wanted autonomy to discern their own fate. There's a comment here that there are Christian Arabs in Iraq, Egypt, Israel, and other Middle Eastern countries, but they're not Maronites. Absolutely. One of the things that differentiates a lot of Christians across the Middle Eastern spectrum is the degree to which or not they consider themselves part of the Arab project. So if we talk about, for example, the Greek Orthodox populations, who during the Ottoman Empire were called Rum, these populations disproportionately consider themselves Arabs. They speak Arabic as their dominant language. They spend time with other Arabs. They identify with the nationalist movements of Arabs. In fact, we're going to see several Palestinian Greek Orthodox Christians like George Habash, who identify quite easily as Arabs. You have groups that are other ethno-religious identities, like the Copts, like the Assyrians, like the Armenians, who don't identify as Arab, but don't find an issue intermingling with Arab spaces or speaking Arabic as a dominant or even first language in certain cases. And then you have groups like the Maronites, who wholesale or mostly will reject this Arab identity because of the political implications. And I have a really great question here. If Lebanese means Maronite Christian and other ethnic groups are Arab, why is Lebanon not just the old Mount Lebanon province of the Ottomans with the rest of modern day Lebanon given to Syria? And we are literally about to get there. That is one of the linchpin questions of modern Lebanese politics. So so we'll hold on. When Syria fell, and remember that the British tried to help King Faisal II, King Faisal, who was the son of the Sharif of Mecca, come to power in Damascus, and he was coronated, but the French wanted to turn the territory into a mandate, and so they launched an invasion and defeated the forces of Yusuf al-Althama, who was the Minister of Defense for Hashemite Syria, in the Battle of Maysalun. The part that we should stress here with regards to Lebanon is that the French landed at Beirut in order to get to Maysalun. And in fact, you can see from the map that the Syrians never effectively controlled the coast. They may have controlled somehow or another the areas that would become the Alawite regions. But Beirut was perfectly open, and the Lebanese wanted to be under French control. The French were willing to create a greater Lebanon. When they controlled Syria, they created this division of territories. So we should talk a little bit about what Greater Lebanon was. All right. So the Maronites understood that controlling the mountain would not be sustainable as an independent territory. And they did not want to be an autonomous territory under the control of the Syrians because they didn't trust them. And the Syrians had a significantly larger population. By significantly larger, I mean at least 5 times larger. So the ideal solution would have been to give them just the mountain. But the mountain doesn't have fertile agricultural plains. It doesn't have territory in which to grow food. And if we remember from the famine of Mount, what the Lebanese were most concerned about at this moment, just a few years after that massive starvation, was that they would never starve again. And so they petitioned the French to give them more territory in the surrounding valleys, especially the valley to the east, the Bekaa Valley, and some of the territory to the south. Now, these territories were strongly Muslim majority and heavily populated. And so the French constrained the territory as best they could to those territories that, when put together with the Maronites would still be, along with other Christians, a small majority. And so there became a question of how to organize the ideology of such a state. And so you have Maronite thinkers like Sayyid Aql, who come up with this idea called Phoenicianism, which is the idea that all Lebanese are descended from the Phoenicians in one way or another. Sure, there is some Arab admixture from the Arabians who conquered in the Battle of Yarmouk, and sure, there is some Crusader admixture from the Crusaders who used to build castles along the mountain. But by and large, the population of Lebanon is the descendants of the Phoenicians, be they Muslim or Christian, and therefore they should have a loyalty to Lebanon itself, not to the wider Arab project. Understandably, Phoenicianism was far more attractive to the Maronites than it was to the Muslim populations. And so you can see that the close collaboration between the French and the Maronites resulted in this Greater Lebanon project being widely supported by the Maronites themselves, and the French having a much more positively seen role as imperial creators of territory than they did, as we saw in Syria, where they were thoroughly hated and we had revolutions. Gouraud himself was effectively a military governor, and you can even see that the flag of Lebanon as a colonial possession was the French flag with the Lebanese cedar, meaning that the Lebanese were embracing that sort of French identity. As we pointed out, the Syrians, by contrast, fought quite strongly against the French and the numerous abuses that they had visited upon the Syrians. But there's notably one group absent from all the Syrians who rebelled. There was not one single major Christian commander among the Syrians. There were Sunnis, there were Shiites, there were Druze, there were Kurds, but no Christians. So as we move closer to 1943, when the French would eventually be removed from the region, we start to get to Lebanese politics. And so there's a census taken in 1932. In fact, there hasn't been a single census in Lebanon since this point. So what has changed is mostly in people's minds more than it is a quantifiable reality. But most people agree that the number of Muslims have increased at the cost of the number of Christians. And as the Lebanese were moving closer and closer towards independence, you had those who were more conservative on the Christian side and who wanted to retain this kind of Maronite control, this kind of status quo that had served them well in the French period. And you had Muslims in Lebanon who, by and large, saw their future as tied with that of Syria. And they saw that they had been illegally roped in to this Greater Lebanon project. And in truth, there was no reason that Lebanon should be separated from Syria any more than those other states were separated from Syria, be it the Alexandretta district, the Alawite coastal district around Latakia, the Druze mountain, the state of Damascus, the state of Aleppo. All those were united into Syria. Lebanon was simply the last piece that hadn't. And after that, it should be Jordan, Israel, and Palestine that are incorporated into Syria, because, of course, the whole Levant is that Syrian nationalist project. And so, in order to prevent the country from coming to civil war at this point, there's a national pact made. Since the Christians are a slight majority over the Muslims, and the Druze count as Muslims in the Lebanese calculation, the Christians are entitled to 6 to 5 representation in the parliament. So the Christians will have parliamentary dominance. But the Christians and the Muslim both have to accept an independent Lebanon. The Muslims have to accept that they will not be part of that greater Syria project, at least as far as is currently known. They're going to have to be part of an independent Lebanon. And the Christians, especially the Maronites, have to accept that calling in the French is not going to work anymore. Lebanon will be a country that is tied to the Arab world socioculturally, not politically, and tied to the West socioculturally, but not politically. And the Muslim and Christian sides sign the first new Lebanese flag, which is the cedar, the same cedar from the colonial times, but without the colors of the French flag behind them. The reason that Lebanon's independence was in 1943 is because of World War II. Now, as we've discussed in several other episodes, during World War II, France was an Allied power until it was defeated by the Nazi Germans in June of 1940. And as a result, France was divided into 2 sections. The northern part was directly occupied by the Germans, and the southern part was created into a puppet regime, which has been called Vichy France as a general common name. All of the colonies of the French Empire, the mandates of Lebanon and Syria among them, were considered to be part of Vichy France. And so the British, leading an Australian regiment, and the Free French invaded Lebanon and Syria to eject the Vichy French in Operation Exporter, which we've discussed during our World War II discussion. And as a result, Lebanon and Syria were granted independence. And so on the 2nd of November 1943, a number of the leaders came together from the different communities, in particular Bashar al-Khoury and Riyad al-Sulh. Bashar al-Khoury from the Maronite community, Riyad al-Sulh from the Sunni community, and they decided to build the Lebanese government. Now, the French immediately arrested them for an act of sedition against their authority, because despite the fact that the Free French had promised that they were going to allow the Lebanese to govern themselves if they supported the Free French in removing the Vichy French, the Free French decided that they actually wanted to keep their empire. Pressure from the British eventually resulted in them releasing the prisoners from Reshaya prison, and they were brought, and they were, on 22nd of November 1943, and they were allowed to actually make Lebanon an independent country. Now, as we remember, the French were not as nice when it came to Syria, and in fact, it took the British militarily expelling the French from the territory for the Syrians to become independent. So, of course, the question arises, why were the French much more willing to give up on Lebanon, let's say, than they were to give up on Syria? And the answer is that because of the historical relationship that the French had established with the Lebanese, the French thought that as an independent state, Lebanon was more likely to be French-friendly than Syria was. And so it wasn't necessary to hold on to the Lebanese with the same amount of fortitude as they did in Syria. So we then move into the Arab-Israeli War. And from the position of the Lebanese, the population was deeply divided. The Maronites wanted nothing to do with a war against Israel. In many cases, the Maronites saw a similarity between themselves and the Israelis, namely that they were a non-Muslim group surrounded by Arab Muslims, and that they were trying to fight for their own independence or autonomy. There was also no territory that the Zionists were claiming, or that later the State of Israel, would, when it became established, was claiming, that the Maronites also claimed. They simply had no overlapping territory. And so there was no necessary fight from that perspective. The Sunni Muslims especially, but the Shiite Muslims as well, were intensely sympathetic towards the Palestinian cause. And so they finally forced the Lebanese hand in getting into the war, despite the fact that Bashar al-Khoury was a Christian, right? All the presidents of Lebanon under the National Pact have to be Christian. All the prime ministers have to be Sunni, and all the speakers of the parliament need to be Shiite. There are other positions that are ethnically qualified as well. But the Lebanese crossed the border into Israel at the village of Al-Malikiya. The Israelis routed the Lebanese force there, and the Lebanese went back to the other side of the border. That was the entire Lebanese involvement in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 from a military perspective. It's a very different conversation about what the Arab-Israeli War did from a functional perspective. The first thing is that while the Lebanese crossed back over their border, and that was it from the Lebanese army from an offensive standpoint, the Israelis crossed the border into Lebanon and only pulled back later. So a number of Lebanese villages came under Israeli occupation as a result of the 1948 war during the wartime. But far more disastrous for Bashar al-Khoury was the Nakba. The Nakba, or the Great Catastrophe, was the expulsion or flight or removal or escape of roughly 720,000 to 780,000 Palestinian Arabs in wake of the Israeli Independence War. And 100,000 of them went to Lebanon, which, by the way, is more than went to Syria, despite Syria's much better ability to contain them. And this population was overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim, which meant a huge question to the demographic balance within Lebanon. And so the Lebanese resolved that under no conditions could the Palestinians become Lebanese. If they were to become Lebanese, they would disrupt this balance. They would disrupt the National Pact of 1943, and therefore they can't become citizens. Furthermore, because they were to be taken care of by UNRWA and soon returned to their homeland, they shouldn't be given Lebanese work permits so that they wouldn't compete with Lebanese for jobs while they're waiting to go back to their homes. And so this set up a situation where the Palestinians would live in refugee camps. And by refugee camps, we're talking about small cities that are shanty towns with no economic prospects, no possibility of leaving where they are, and no possibility of returning to their homes because Israel was controlling those. Bashar al-Khoury presided over one of the better times in Lebanon's history. As the president, he was able to take immense advantage of the fact that Israel's independence war effectively meant that the port of Haifa, which had been the major port for exports in the Middle East, oil, for grain and produce, could no longer be used. There was no country that bordered Israel that had a peace treaty with them. There was no country where border crossing was permitted. And so Beirut became the new port of the entire Middle East on the Levant, and it became extremely popular for people to ship there. You also have a situation where Bashar al-Khoury sees that it's an opportune moment that since Arab business is coming through the port of Beirut, that Arabs and Western leaders can begin to do business in Lebanon as sort of a throughway point. A lot of Western companies were skittish about making offices in places like Saudi Arabia or Egypt, places that were very volatile, or in the case of Saudi Arabia, very difficult to live in from a Western perspective. Lebanon was a modern westernized state, and so it felt like a more natural home for these kinds of businesses. And Lebanon, of course, reaped the rewards as more and more companies began to put their money in Lebanon because of its strategic position. Lebanon also began to dissociate itself from the Syrian economy more and more, as Syria began to become more withdrawn under Kawatli. The Lebanese decided to disassociate their franc from the Syrian franc and began to pursue their own banking economy, which, of course, as I mentioned, was doing relatively well. But one of the things that's worth pointing out about Bashar al-Khoury is that he was balancing two different governing systems at the same time. In 1943, the Lebanese had written a constitution, and that became the constitution of the state of Lebanon, and it talked about how many members of the parliament there were and what their offices were and how they would function. And separate from that, there was the executive branch of ministers and business people. And so Bashar al-Khoury began to centralize more and more power away from the parliament and into this set of ministerial portfolios in the executive. Now, because there was no national pact governing the ministerial posts, they were disproportionately Maronite. And many of them were Za'im, these historical leaders with large-scale tracts of land or other monetary interests that could be put towards the capital growth and development of Lebanon. And so we have a situation where increasingly a lot of the Muslim population within Lebanon begins to feel that Bashar al-Khoury is ostracizing them from the political game. And so at Deir al-Qamar, a number of Muslim leaders and some Christian leaders, like Camille Chamoun, agree that they are going to present their demands to Bashar al-Khoury. In 1952, they made those demands, things like freedom of speech and of the press, independence of the judiciary, the ability for different people who weren't just nobles to sit in the parliament, all these kinds of questions and issues. Bashar al-Khoury tried to stay in power, but when he realized that he had no constituent bloc, he conceded to Camille Chamoun. Now, it's worth pointing out that Camille Chamoun was probably not the best choice to succeed Bashar al-Khoury from the position of the people assembled at Deir al-Qamar. But there was one major problem. Camille Chamoun was the only one of significant standing who was Maronite Christian. And since the president has to be a Maronite Christian under the National Pact, he was the one who was put forward. And he ran on a campaign promise to end the corruption, to restore more power to the legislature, and to reach out more to the Muslim community of Lebanon. we'll see how well he didn't do at that. Now, a few points to make about what happened during Bashar al-Khoury's reign. There was increasing pressure from a number of Muslims in the country affiliated with the Syrian Social Nationalist Party to bring Syria and Lebanon together. This was exacerbated by Lebanon and Syria's failure in the war against Israel, which to the Syrian Social Nationalist Party proved that that the problem was that there were 5 Arab countries that went to war with Israel as opposed to one gigantic one. Bashar al-Khoury didn't appreciate the movement, and so its leader, Anton Saadeh, sought protection in Damascus, where Hosni al-Zaim was recently put in power, and Hosni al-Zaim promised him that he would be protected. But as soon as he came there, Hosni al-Zaim packaged him up and sent him right back to Lebanon, where Bashar al-Khoury put him through a show trial and then a forcible execution. One thing I want to point out with the Cold War alliances is that in many respects, Lebanon wasn't in this discussion. It was certainly more Western aligned than not. But in many cases, Lebanon actually served as a place where both sides of the Cold War could exist jointly and perform listening posts, interview locals, and get a better sense of the land. In many ways, the same way that Lebanon became the entry point for business into the Middle East, Lebanon became, for the spying community, the entry point into the Middle East. Starting in the 1960s, we have the wave of Arab socialism, and we've talked about Arab socialism on a number of different occasions. But suffice to say, there was one part of the population that found the mood and the views of Nasser extremely exciting. And there was one group that found them incredibly terrifying. And you can imagine exactly which 2 groups those are. So when Camille Chamoun becomes president, as I said, he argues that he's going to fight back against the corruption, avoid using ministers. He promised to Kamal Jumblat, who you can see there, that he was going to, who's a Druze politician, that he was going to make numerous concessions to Muslims. In fact, he did most of the opposite of that. What he ended up doing was further strengthening the ministerial portfolios and pulling more and more power away from the parliament. It's one of the duties of the president is also to appoint the prime minister. And so he would choose, because it had to be a Sunni, he would choose a Sunni who was relatively weak in terms of his ability to govern the country. And so Camille was able to accord more and more power to himself with these weak-willed individuals. Camille also realized that in the context of the Cold War, the sort of neutral policy of Bashar al-Khoury wasn't going to necessarily keep him in power. And so he made it clear that he was pro-Western in orientation. He started reaching out to the United States as early as 1953 for weapons and for funding. And in 1954, he allowed US military planes to begin to do reconnaissance out of Lebanon. As we got towards the end of his reign, Nasser became more and more popular. And you can actually see that there were Lebanese Muslims that were protesting both the rule of Camille Chamoun and were excited to see Nasser in the streets of Beirut talking about the possibility of Arab socialism coming to Lebanon and the incorporation of Lebanon into the United Arab Republic. Remember, in 1958, this is when Egypt and Syria are uniting in that form of that United Arab Republic. And so Lebanon was considered by many in the Nasserist camp to be the next country to be joined to this republic, given its position relative to Syria. But let's take a moment and talk about Lebanon in the 1950s and what was going on here. We've talked about a number of these points already, but it bears repeating that Lebanon was a place that a lot of people liked to vacation in, both from Europe and from the Arab world. The ability and attractions of Lebanon from the Arab perspective was the wide variety of weather and of coastline. Lebanon has mountains where you can ski. It has beautiful beaches. It has everything in between, really. And a number of these places were specifically designed to cater to tourists, like casinos, like and hotels. The entire system was set up that way. Lebanese banking, especially with intrabank that we're going to get to in a bit, was incredibly secretive from a European perspective, which meant that Arab laundered money could be stored there safely and integrated into businesses that Europeans were trying to bring over from Europe into the Arab world. Also, the fact that these were Lebanese banks as opposed to foreign banks meant that these banks were going to give loans to Lebanese to build their own businesses and create the economy. You also had a number of Arabs who had fled from the regimes in Egypt or in Syria or Iraq during the 1950s, which because those governments began expropriating a lot of wealthy individuals' land or ownings, and so they'd rather put that money in a Lebanese bank where they felt that it would be safe. One of the ironies of the golden age of Lebanon is that for all the argumentation during the Greater Lebanon period that the acquisition of the Muslim majority territories into Greater Lebanon was done in order to provide enough food so that the area wouldn't starve, a lot of the Lebanese economy was strongly tied to the Syrian economy, where they would trade advanced technological imports from Europe for Syrian grain in order to keep themselves from starving. So as we mentioned, we have this United Arab Republic bordering Lebanon and looking mighty intimidating. And the Nasserists were increasingly popular. In fact, in 1958, in order to try and push out Camille Chamoun, who was trying to run for a second term as president, Camille Chamoun called in the Americans. So what's going on here? Eisenhower had said in January of 1957 that any Middle Eastern country that is facing a communist threat is one where the United States would be willing to respond with force to protect the stability of such a country. Now, Camille Chamoun's opposition was not communist. Nasserists are a lot of things. They believe in a certain degree of land expropriation and redistribution, but they don't believe in workers. They don't believe in command economies or workers' unions. They're not anything close to communism as it was understood. And the Eisenhower administration in the United States understood that. But they also didn't want to see a Cold War ally fall. And so they consolidated their forces and invaded what's called Operation Blue Bat. Before they had arrived, as you can see from the map, the opposition forces, the Nasserists, were able to control pretty much the entire southern half of the country. And it looked like this would be a Lebanese civil war. But the Americans, within a month of arriving in Operation Blue Bat, were able to negotiate with a number of Lebanese generals. Fouad Shahab was a particularly interesting character in that he had been asked by both, he had been asked by Camille Chamoun whether or not he would be willing to force the Lebanese people to accept his authority. And he made clear that while he would defend Lebanon from external threats as a military leader, he would not use his power to attack the Lebanese people. So the Americans thought that he was somebody that they could work with, and so they gave a truce where Camille Chamoun would not be allowed to run for another term, and instead Fouad Shahab would become the president of Lebanon. Now, Fouad Shahab was actually going to reverse a lot of policies that we saw during the Shamoun period. Shamoun had continued Bashar al-Khoury's favoritism towards the Maronites and the entrenchment of their prerogatives. Fouad Shahab did exactly the opposite. He created a strong alliance with the Sunni prime minister, Rashid Karami. And Rashid Karami had many opinions opposed to those of Fouad Shahab, probably most importantly, his view on wider international politics. But the two of them were able to create a coalition government that was able to increase the prosperity for Muslims and begin to even out a number of the economic and social issues. In fact, this movement of trying to, as a Maronite leader, try to create some sort of equality with the Muslim population was called Shahabism, after Fouad Shahab. But Fouad Shahab managed to take control and hold control using a little inspiration from Syria. Now, the Deuxième Bureau that existed in Lebanon was never as fully integrated and theatrically horrendous as in Syria, but it certainly served a purpose of maintaining intelligence contacts and keeping the civilians from outright rebellion. And he was able to increase its power through the actions of a coup led by the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. The coup was unsuccessful, and it was around New Year's between 1961 and 1962. And it further discredited the Syrian Social Nationalist Party because they were trying to overthrow the Lebanese government. But Fouad Shahab argued that if they could get that close, if they could attempt something like this, then he needed more power to see what was going on. And so while there was unprecedented prosperity while Shahab was in power, and that prosperity was distributed well among its citizens, it didn't ultimately result in a freer country. On the contrary, it became a country that was more of a police state than it had ever been before. Part of the equalization of opportunity and prosperity, however, required making changes that would directly affect the Za'im, these empowered families and clans. And most of them were not terribly interested in ceding their power. And so they formed an opposition movement to Shihab. Now, Shihab was going to run for the presidency again if he was allowed, and he probably would have won. The amount of Muslims who would have voted for him would have put him over the top. But he argued that the Lebanese presidency is a one-term situation, and so he would not run again, but he made his favorite known. That was Charles Helou, and Charles Helou came to power immediately after him. Unlike Shahab, though, Helou was not an effective negotiator or coordinator, and in many respects got bullied by a lot of the Maronite functionaries into taking a line that was closer to their view. So I now want to tell a little bit about Yusuf Beidas and Intrabank. So Intrabank was far and away the most successful of the Lebanese banks. It was founded by Yusuf Beidas. He had served in the Barclays office in Jerusalem in 1948, before the war had begun with Israel. He was a Palestinian by ethnicity. His wife was Lebanese, and so he fled to Lebanon with her, and he founded Intrabank. Now, when he first founded the bank, it's one of these rags to riches stories of, he was a corner teller with barely any furniture in the office, and by the end of it, he's a multimillionaire. Intrabank was effective not just because of Beidas's acumen, which is considerable, but because he understood the pivotal place that Lebanon was playing in terms of the connections between East and West. And so many of the largest industries and operations in Lebanon had accounts at Intrabank, like the Lebanese national airplane carrier. However, in 1966, there was a cash shortfall. Now, it's clear from reports that we have now that Intrabank would have been able to cover the cash shortfall if the Lebanese government had bailed them out in the short term, that they could be repaid later. But the Lebanese government didn't want to bail him out. In many respects, Yusuf Beidas had cultivated a large number of enemies from from not just the Maronite Zaim, but from Zaim of other groups who felt that his status as a nouveau riche Palestinian threatened to undercut the position of the Lebanese, and so they saw the opportunity to sink his bank. There are many debates as to whether that was the actual thought process or whether the Lebanese government was relying on evidence that they had at the time that his bank was insolvent. Regardless, they ultimately led to the decline of Intrabank. Another reason that the Lebanese may have been cautious to support Yusuf Beidas is that Beidas was an ardent supporter of the Palestinian cause. And in particular in Lebanon, what that ultimately meant is a lot of Palestinian militia groups called Fedayeen had begun showing up in Lebanon, and this will only increase as time goes on, creating a degree of instability. So Yusuf Beidas was, in the respect of many of the Zaim, fomenting this sort of internal rebellion within Lebanon, and that couldn't be tolerated either. The actual way that the bank ended up collapsing is that the Saudis actually demanded, Saudis and several other Gulf groups pulled all their money out of the bank, that caused a bank run, and the bank run ultimately resulted in the funds collapsing. In many ways, this is a case of killing the goose that laid the golden egg. With the collapse of Bank Intra, Europeans were no longer confident in the Lebanese banking system and began to bank more in Europe. Neither were Arabs, who also began to bank more in Europe. And so the Lebanese market became increasingly dominated by foreign banks that were more predatory towards Lebanese and less likely to lend to Lebanese businesses. Right after the collapse of Intra and during the reign of Charles Helou was the Six-Day War against Israel. And again, the position in Lebanon was deeply divided, with the Maronites not being interested in antagonizing Israel and the Sunnis wanting to get involved. Confrontation with Israel would begin to escalate because a number of refugees had fled into Lebanon after the 1967 war. And these refugees had bolstered the strength of the Palestinian militias that were already operating in the region, like the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And in 1968, 26th of December 1968, the PFLP got onto an El Al flight from Rome heading to Tel Aviv and hijacked the plane, forcing it to land in Algeria. The Israelis argued that the Lebanese had given cover to the PFLP, had let them organize, and were responsible indirectly for the hijacking of the flight. And so they sent a special forces brigade to Beirut and destroyed 14 Lebanese aircraft on the tarmac as retribution. It may surprise people, but Israel was sharply rebuked for this act, and it was seen as wholly disproportionate, considering that Lebanon had no control over who got on which plane in Rome. The Americans gave a sharply worded letter and left it at that. The French went far further. Israel and France had developed a relationship that was based on their shared antipathy towards Arab nationalism. The French were trying to dampen it in Algeria, and the Israelis were trying to dampen it in the Palestinian territories. And so by the 1950s, Israel was buying a significant number of French military aircraft, especially the Mirage 3. But this put the nail in the coffin of that relationship. Starting in 1962, when the French had given independence to Algeria, it no longer felt the need to oppose Arab nationalism. There were no French territories under threat from it. But France did have a long southern border with the Mediterranean, and across that Mediterranean were numerous Arab states with which it wanted to foster better relations. This Operation Gift ended up serving the French interests rather well in giving them an excuse to launch an embargo against Israel for any arms shipments, meaning that many Israeli airplanes that were French made and required French parts could no longer be serviced. And during this time, it's not just that the Palestinian militant organizations are hijacking Israeli planes, but that within Lebanon, the Palestinians are becoming more and more directly concerned about their inability to escape the situation that they've been placed in. Remember that they are effectively locked in these refugee camps because they can't get working papers, they can't get citizenship papers, and they can't go anywhere. And so you begin to see these militias begin to control more and more of the territory within Lebanon that these camps begin to occupy. And Emil Bustani, who was one of the Za'im, went down to Cairo to talk to Nasser and the recently appointed head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, about creating some kind of relationship between the Lebanese government, which was increasingly unable to restrain or control these PLO militias, and the PLO militias. And the Cairo Agreement that they came to in 1969 was that effectively the Palestinians would be able to create a state within a state in Lebanon. And so they began to effectively rule themselves in their in the country, rule themselves in the country. And you had what was effectively a poor policing situation. The Lebanese could not stop what was effectively a gang moving around its territory. And this gives us the backdrop of the Phalange's reaction to this. Now, the Phalange had already existed. It was a Maronite militia, and it had grown increasingly strong over the 1960s as Muslims became more and more irate by in the 1950s, as Muslims became more and more irate because of the actions of Camille Chamoun. And the Phalange represented that Christian minority that was increasingly becoming smaller, that wanted to preserve the status quo, that didn't want to see changes because they were afraid. Many Christians in Lebanon were afraid, going back to 1918, that if Muslims were in control or they had an equal say, that equal say could eventually morph into full control because of the population differential. And then the Christians would be subject to Muslim rule, a rule which they felt would not be one that looked after their interests and needs. So the rise of Palestinian violence and violent gangs served to animate the Sunni and Shiite Muslim populations within Lebanon for the possibility that there could be either an overturn of power or there could be some new bargaining on the national pact, perhaps equality for both the Muslims and the Christians, or perhaps something that's pure democracy or any other system. Regardless, the Phalange wanted to prevent whatever those possibilities could be because most of them didn't look good from the Christian perspective. In 1970, there's an effective referendum on the politics of Shihadism as implemented by Sharhelou, and Shihab before, and Fouad Shihab before him. And in that election, Elias Sarkis, who is the Shihabist, actually loses the election by 1 vote. It ends up being that Suleiman Frangieh becomes the victor. And Suleiman Frangieh was not in favor of a more equal approach towards Muslims. He was in favor of a stronger support for the Christian population and leadership. And so you can see that the Phalange is reacting to this election by trying to support its own position that Lebanon should remain a Christian-ruled country and should remain a country that looks out after the interests of its Christians. Especially as now with Intrabank gone, the Lebanese economy is in free fall because a lot of the businesses that received loans from banks like Intrabank can no longer do so with the bank shuttered. And foreign banks aren't lending to small farmers. And so throughout the different belts of Lebanon, you're beginning to have economic dislocation occur at a far faster rate than would be expected, further exacerbating the tensions that inequality brought with it. And if that wasn't enough to be an issue, as we mentioned when we talked about the Palestinians had already asserted in Jordan in 1970 that they were going to take control of the country. They had their own states within states in Jordan, just like they had in Lebanon. And King Hussein had to make the decision to actually launch a war and try and take Jordan back from the Palestinian militants, fighting a year-long war from September to July of 1970 to July of 1971, which eventually resulted in the Palestinian Liberation Organization fully moving its operations from Jordan to Lebanon. Further complicating matters, right, in 1970, as we mentioned, Hafez al-Assad took direct power in Syria, and Hafez al-Assad and Suleiman Frangieh were actually very close friends of each other from a leadership perspective. And so we now have a number of different deck chairs being assembled. We have an increasing rise in Palestinian militarism. We have a corresponding rise in Phalangist militarism. And the Phalangists are defending the Maronite interests. Maronites believe that they will have a good partner in Syria if they need protection. And we're beginning to get to a place where both sides are less and less willing to negotiate the possibility of not getting the Lebanon that they want. And so we end up with a number of small-scale skirmishes. Now, we need to sort of understand at a very fundamental level what the Lebanese Civil War looked like. It doesn't look like the American Civil War in several different respects. The first one is that with regards to the American Civil War, if you weren't anywhere near the front line of the advancing troops, you weren't in physical danger. You may be starving, you may be, you may be, restless or something else, but you're not going to be killed by a stray bullet. In Lebanon, the fighting was everywhere and in all places. And so what ends up happening is that Lebanon becomes like a checkerboard controlled by different groups in different regions. And in order to pass through them, you need to go through a bunch of different checkpoints, which means the people of Lebanon end up living very constrained lives in terms of how much territory they can cover. Another important thing is that the battle is not consistent. And so we're going to see in a bit, but people tried to live ordinary lives during the 14 years of war. There would be attacks on a certain city block, and as quickly as they come, they would go. There are jokes that people, would have a fancy dinner party and you could hear shelling in the background. And the hostess would simply ask, do we want to wait for the shelling to stop before I serve hors d'oeuvres, or should we just eat now? Is everybody too hungry? So you have this weird system that exists where there is both peace and war occurring at the same moment. And the final piece that sort of correlates to both of these two is that we're not seeing an army versus an army. We are going to see foreign armies involved, is the Israeli army and the Syrian army and the American army to a certain extent, the Marines. But there's not a Lebanese army that's running around. There are a number of different militias which function much closer to criminal gangs or small freedom fighter forces than they do anything that's systematized and organized. So then let's get to the beginning of the war. So what ends up happening is that you have increasing antagonism that shows between the phalangists on the one side and the Palestinian militants on the other. And this erupts into a number of sporadic pieces of violence. Beirut itself becomes a divided city, as you have a majority Christian part in the east and a majority Muslim part in the west. And these two parts, though, have a number of pockets of minorities sitting within them. And so you have massacres like Quarantina, where one side will simply eliminate all of the members of the other ethno-religious groups that it finds in those territories. One of the strange ironies of the war, and you can sort of see it with the green line of Beirut, is that this is the line that divided West Beirut from East Beirut. And because it was effectively a no man's territory, life began to retake that area of the city. And that verdant green plant life was effectively what gave the name the Green Line of Beirut. And so areas that had been absolutely beautiful in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, in the 1970s and 1980s became the scene of warfare and dilapidation. We also see that from the earliest days of the war, external parties were trying to influence the policy. The Syrians sent over the Palestinian Liberation Army. We should be clear that the Palestinian Liberation Army and the Palestinian Liberation Organization are two different entities. The Palestinian Liberation Organization is a Palestinian group that was founded by Palestinians to advocate for their own interests. We can argue about how well it does that, but that's the point of it. The Palestinian Liberation Army is a false flag military by the Syrians using a number of Palestinian refugees along with Syrian trainers and leaders in order to effectively be a covert force that incentivizes Palestinians to fight. And so what you end up seeing in the early days of the war is that the phalangists feel threatened by both the PLO and the PLA increasingly, and start besieging a number of cities like Tel al-Zatar, which is a Palestinian refugee camp in Beirut, in order to try and stop these gangs. In fact, in June of 1976, the phalangists felt that they were on the verge of losing the war, and they cried out to Hafez al-Assad to support them. Remember that Assad and Farangia, the current president of Lebanon, were relatively close friends, and so the thought was that the Syrians would invade, and that they would restore the pre-war system. The Syrians actively participated in the siege of Tel el-Za'atar, and this resulted in wide-scale condemnation in the Arab world. As we talked about when we saw it from the Syrian perspective, the Syrians were actually not that interested in securing Phalangist success. Their goal was to annex Lebanon and to make it part of Syria. Hafez al-Assad believed that the two parts of Syria that have been removed by the French and stayed removed, that is Lebanon and Alexandretta, should be returned to Syrian control. And so in 1976, with their soldiers now in the country, they decided to switch sides. And part of that switching sides was the creation of the Arab Deterrent Force. Now, as we pointed out when we talked about Syria, the Arab Deterrent Force was majority Syrian. And while there were other Arab states that contributed a few troops, over 80% of the troops were Syrian, and those that weren't Syrian ended up leaving soon after. The Syrian attempted goal as peacekeepers simply didn't work, and it didn't make sense. This led to a number of conflicts with the Syrian military and some of the Phalangist groups, as well as other Christian militias like the Tigers. In particular, the Syrians were forced out of Beirut in the 100 Days War, or at least they were forced out of East Beirut. And Bashir Gemayel launched his attack on the Syrian stronghold in the Bekaa Valley in order to try and push the Syrians out. Now, understandably, because the Syrians have an actual military and the Phalangists were a bunch of individual militants, the Syrians had the upper edge. So let's talk about a little bit of life during the war. So you have all these different groups that are shifting from side to side. And I like this map from December of 1986 to January of 1987. It's a short period in which none of the borders changed. And so you can see from this map that the Maronites control all those red areas, the Syrians control all the purple areas, the Israelis control all the yellow areas. There are UN zones that are designed to be peacekeeping zones. Amal, which is a Shiite movement, controls the black areas, and the green areas are controlled by other Sunni aligned groups. So the country is this patchwork of just different areas in control, different regions, and there's constant fighting to try and bring these together. And you can see from the picture on the left-hand side what a checkpoint looks like. And these checkpoints were erected all across the country when you were moving from an area controlled by one militant group to an area controlled by another militant group, in order to prevent people with weapons from coming through. Now, not all these checkpoints were benign. There are numerous stories of people being pulled over at checkpoints, being of the wrong ethno-religious group, and then discovering that they were going to be shot on sight. The Lebanese Civil War was a devastating conflict, to put it mildly, and we should understand that it resulted in the deaths of 250,000 people. Most of those people were civilians, and most of those, and that number of people, to give again perspective, is around 3 to 4 times the amount of people that have died in the whole Arab-Israeli conflict since the year 1900. This was a massive war for a small country. But people had to find a way to continue living in the middle of the chaos if they couldn't get out, or they didn't want to get out, or there was no life for them they could imagine outside. Sometimes they would hide in underground bunkers. Sometimes they would hide in apartments. They, as you can see there, you have Lebanese militia. These are Muslims, but they're putting up the Christmas tree so they can celebrate with their Christian co-fighters. Because remember, the coalitions are not just strictly Maronite versus Sunni versus Shiite. There are different contingents within them. And so there are Maronite groups or Greek Orthodox groups that fight alongside Muslim militias. And the Palestinians are mixed of both Christian and Muslim, mostly Muslim, but they're mixed. And so you have this religious convivencia, even as people with a defined ethno-religious identity are fighting each other. You also have very famous sort of places that survived during the war and had their own story. This is the Commodore Hotel. This is a picture actually from the 1960s, so before the war. But the Commodore Hotel got through most of the war and was one of the places where international journalists tended to stay. When it fell under Muslim control, because it's part of West Beirut, and the Amal movement was very much anti-alcohol, they had to close down their bar, and they opened up the 7th floor as a speakeasy. So you have all these sort of ways that people try to live in the constant chaos that is a lawless society. And in fact, life during the Civil War could be much more closely related to a gang-ridden town or a post-zombie apocalypse situation than it is a traditional war with strict battle lines and organization. As Syria began to pivot within Lebanon, it's important to see where the thought process was in Syria. So we talked about how in 1973, Hafiz al-Assad had reached out to Said Musa al-Sadr in Lebanon. He was a Shiite cleric in order to provide legitimacy for him as a Muslim, right? Remember, he was an Alawite ethnically, and Alawites weren't considered Muslims by most Muslims. So in order for him to get the imprimatur, he needed a Muslim to sign off on how Alawism is actually Islam. And Musa al-Sadr had done that. But of course, Musa al-Sadr's help didn't really come free. The assumption was that Syria would cultivate a relationship with those militants that he supported, which became known as the Hope Movement or the Amal Movement. And you can see them there with a portrait of Sayyid Musa al-Sadr. The Syrians reached out to this group as their best proxies in the war. And it turns out that over time, the Amal movement became the strongest Shiite component within the Lebanese Civil War. However, starting in 1982, Iran also started putting its feet into the Lebanese conflict as part of its power projection and trying to create areas that would be more open to the Islamic Revolution. One of those groups that found its way there was Hezbollah, which was founded in 1982. And Hezbollah and the Amal movement began to be competitors, with the Syrians supporting the Amal movement and the Iranians supporting Hezbollah. As the war progressed more and more, Amal became more of a political party and less of a militant party, and Hezbollah began to absorb more and more of that role. But of course, as we pointed out, the Syrians were coalescing around militias on multiple sides of the fighting. So the Palestinian Liberation Army, which was that Syrian proxy army, was fighting on the Sunni side of the war. So in certain cases, the Syrian-supported Palestinian Liberation Army would fight the Syrian-supported Amal movement over territories that they were contesting. And so the lines and relationships begin to get incredibly fuzzy as we go through the different aspects of the war and who was supporting who. Another perfect example of this kind of confusion is that Danny Chamoun, I believe the son of Camille Chamoun, was running his military group, the Tigers, and Bashir Gemayel was leading the Phalange. And Gemayel wanted to absorb the Tigers, and Danny Chamoun didn't want to. And so there was actually an internecine war between both of these Maronite groups. So you have all of these different conflicts that keep rotating and turning around, and people supporting the people that they're fighting against. It ends up being this very wound up ball. Now, if the amount of contenders in this fight wasn't enough already, the Palestinians believed that they should use their state within a state in Lebanon and the increasing lawlessness in Lebanon as a moment to fight against Israel. And we talked about the Al-Mughrabi in the context of both Israel and the Palestinian experience. And we've talked about the Syrians trying to Baathify the Palestinians with a Sa'iqa, which is that they took Syrian Palestinians who were Baathists and sent them to Lebanon to convince Lebanese Palestinians to become Baathists. Mixed success. But both of these groups began to target Israel and Israeli diplomats for attack, like Shlomo Argov, who was attacked in 1982 in the UK. So in order to deal with these cross-border threats, Israel began to work with one of the Maronite militias, which is the South Lebanon Army. And so they began to meet in the southern area of Lebanon, where they were fighting against the Shiite groups. Now, one of the ironies is that when Israel later invades in 1981, the invasion is at first welcomed by the Shiite Muslims in southern Lebanon, because those Shiites had been dealing with Palestinians, and the Palestinians had been brutal occupiers of their territory, and the Shiites had been used to being ignored in a negative way by both the Maronites and the Sunnis. But Israel walked into Lebanon without a firm grasp of what Lebanese culture and aspirations were, and certainly had very little understanding of Shiite culture and traditions, considering there were no Shiites in Israel. And in fact, one of the things that quickly soured relations between the Israelis and the Shiites is when the Israelis effectively opened fire on a 10th of Ashura demonstration. 10th of Ashura is a Shiite holiday where they flagellate themselves in commemoration of the death of Ali. And the Israelis basically ran roughshod through the town with their tanks, not realizing that they should leave well enough alone, and that this gathering was not a militant one. But that wasn't the biggest issue that the Israelis had when they looked at Lebanon. The fundamental issue that the Israelis had is that the Israelis imagined Lebanon to be Israel, but just Christian, in the sense that you had a Western-aligned Christian majority group. Yeah, there was an Arab Muslim population in Lebanon, but that Arab Muslim population was a minority, not really part of the state or its infrastructure, not really organized in any coherent way, except for as gangs and other groups like that. And that if Lebanon was restored to being a Christian-controlled state, then there would naturally be peace between Israel and Lebanon. This fundamentally misunderstands what we've been talking about for the last 90 minutes, which is that Lebanon was a pact between the Christians and the Muslims, that there were two Lebanese wills, the Christian will and the Muslim will, and those wills further separate into all their different thorny knots. But a peace with Israel would not be concluded by the Christians without the Muslims signing off. But the Israelis didn't understand this and didn't know this. At the same time, Bashir Gemayel, who you can see on the left-hand side, was coordinating with Israeli Minister of Defense Ariel Sharon. Bashir Gemayel was, like all the other members of the Phalange, like his father Pierre, trying to remove all of the interlopers in Lebanon, especially the Syrian army. And he knew that the Israelis would probably be the most effective in doing that. And so he played nice with the Israelis for that express purpose. And he wanted the Israelis to rely on him as the one Maronite Christian militia with whom the Israelis should do business. And so he indulged the Israelite fancy. And it's not a stretch to say that because the Israelis are so deeply disliked in their own neighborhood, that anybody who remotely shows them any favoritism or attention Israelis tend to have a little bit of a blind spot for. And so Israelis began to support Bashir Gemayel and assume that he had a lot more control over Lebanon and Lebanese policy than he actually did. This resulted in a relationship that was one where Bashir ended up trying to string the Israelis along for as long as possible to get the Syrians out of the country. And Sharon kept trying to push Bashir Gemayel to recognize a peace with the state of Israel as part of a long-term trajectory to free up the northern border. After the invasion was supposed to stay within the southern part of the country, it progressed further north to Beirut in order to put Beirut under Israeli control. The Israelis argued that they were continuing their northward advance to get rid of the Palestinian militants that were in the city of Beirut and therefore force them out of Lebanon, which is actually indeed what happened. In 1982, Lebanon asks for a multinational force led by the French and the Americans to arrive in Lebanon and escort the PLO out of the country. In return, the Israelis are supposed to back out of their occupation of Beirut. The Israelis don't move immediately. While the Israelis are in Beirut, they and the Americans pressure the Lebanese to sign a peace treaty with the state of Israel. Now, you would think that this peace treaty would be signed by Bashir Gemayel. In fact, in 1982, Bashir Gemayel is actually elected president of Lebanon, but most of the districts can't report. And as you can imagine, with the Israelis in control of Beirut, the Mossad was able to change some of the vote tabulations. This is not an anti-Zionist conspiracy. We have information from multiple perspectives that promotes this view. Now that Bashir Gemayel was in power, he was asked by Sharon to sign a peace treaty, and he rejected it in favor of a non-aggression pact. But Ariel Sharon wanted to prove to the Israeli public all the blood and treasure that had been spent in Lebanon would be worth it, and a peace treaty would be the only thing that would be worth so much effort. But before Bashir Gemayel could push back further, he was assassinated on the 14th of September in 1982. The Israelis suspected, and I believe correctly, that Gemayel was using the Israelis to get rid of the Syrians. And so now that Gemayel had consolidated more control, he didn't want to make peace with the Israelis if he didn't have to. His goal was always a free and independent Lebanon. But after Bashir Gemayel was assassinated, his brother Amin Gemayel was sworn in as president, and the Israelis and the Americans talked to Amin, and they decided that they would try to sign an agreement, the second peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state, because the first one had been concluded with Egypt in 1979. Now, this agreement that would have been signed on May 17th, the May 17th agreement, was based on, at least from the Lebanese perspective, the idea that the Israelis would remove their troops from Lebanon and Lebanon would make peace with Israel. From the Israeli perspective, Israel would only remove its soldiers from Lebanon if the Syrians removed their soldiers from Lebanon. And the Syrians showed no interest or attempt of doing so. The Lebanese argued that the Syrians were the Arab deterrent force that had been created by the Arab League, and so it would be an Arab League decision to remove the Syrians that's entirely independent of whatever Israel may say or do. Because of this disagreement in terms of policy, no amount of work by the Americans, and the Americans did try to support this deal financially, the same way that they had supported Sadat financially when he made peace with Israel. it wasn't going to be adhered to. And so even though the declaration was signed on paper, it was a dead letter the moment it was signed. So the last part of this disaster of 1982 to 1983 is that the US, while securing the removal of the Palestinian Liberation Organization to Tunisia, what we end up seeing is that the US Marine barracks are bombed. This leads to Reagan withdrawing all the US forces from, and the MNF in general is withdrawn as well from Lebanon in disgrace for the Americans. So that's all she wrote for today, which actually puts us in a really good position, because then we'll finish out the war next week and get to modern Lebanon. And while you're putting together some questions and comments, let me tell you a little bit about who we are. We are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard, and I do Middle Eastern Islamic history every Wednesday at 7. We also do episodes on Asian philosophy, European security, powerful women, dead languages. Zach, if you're still here, if you want to talk a little bit about what we have coming up. He is not here. Okay. So, and Aaron and I are going to do June, the Russo-Ukrainian war. It looks like the Ukrainians are going to probably launch an offensive between now and then, which is going to be great. We all have something to comment on, and hopefully the Ukrainians can make some headway. So any questions or comments? Hi, Patty.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing all
Uh,
right. How are you?
I'm good. I this is kind of off the chart question, but one thing I kept noticing with all your Lebanon maps is that there are no place names I recognize from any early Christian literature, and I'm just curious, were there different names in an earlier era and I just have forgotten this, or?
Um, I'm trying to think. The city of Tyre used to be called Sur. And so in Hebrew and in Arabic it's still called, in Hebrew it's Sur because there's been a letter change, but in Arabic it's still called Sur. So that's Tyre, but Tyre exists in the Bible. There's actually a prophecy
Yeah, that's the
about
only one that seems familiar, but I wasn't positive.
Sidon. I'm trying to remember. Sidon used to have a different name also. Tripoli was named by the Romans as Trablus, as Tripolitania, right? There were 3 cities.
Okay.
There was Naples in Italy, there was Tripoli in Libya, and Tripoli in Lebanon, and those were the 3 cities, Tripolis.
Huh.
Um, the yeah, so you have a few of these different cities, but there isn't a lot of Christian. Sorry, let me rephrase that. There's not a lot of biblical literature that takes place in Lebanon. A lot of the Christian evangelism goes directly from what's today Israel into what's today Turkey. So we don't have a lot of stuff there. That said, there are evangelists that obviously came to Lebanon. And for example, in the Christian heresies episode, MENA 1B, we talked about St. John of Damascus, right?
Oh, right,
Yohanan
right.
Damascus.
Okay.
So that would have been in Syria, Lebanon.
Okay. Yeah, because again, most of what I think most Christians would be most familiar with would be either the Turkish travel or the directly Western travel toward Rome and Greece, etc.
Exactly. I think if you want to know more about the evangelism, you can there's sort of two things to look at. You can look at the early evangelism, that tends to be Saint Thomas, Saint Bartholomew, Saint Thaddeus. They tend to be more in the northern Levant, northern Mesopotamia sort of area. And then the second wave is the Catholicization, or I don't know what you want to call it, right? Because this is an isolated Catholic population that's not surrounded by other Catholic populations, as opposed to, let's say, mainland Europe, which is entirely surrounded by large scale blocks of Catholics.
The church, yeah, exactly. Well, that it was the Maronite.
And that was with Saint Maron, which is where the term Maronite comes from.
Okay, so that was the part that made me question, why am I not that aware of any Turkish names? The other thing, again, a little bit
But by the way, these are not Turkish names. These are
I mean,
English.
I meant Lebanese. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's after 9 o'clock, Richard. What can I do? The other thing that's a little bit off the direct map here, but I happened to be watching last night one of those programs from, like, I think 2015, PBS First Peoples, and the subject matter was, of course, the meeting of pre-modern human beings and modern human beings, which they now theorize largely happened in this area that we've been talking about. So of course I immediately started connecting it with all of the lectures and webinars you've been doing, because it connected directly with those kinds of constant tensions and changes and things. So it just added a whole new dimension. And then one last thing, again, completely off this map, but for people that are still interested in American history, I think PBS is doing a program at 10 o'clock on the Gadsden flag, that's the one with the snake, the "Don't Tread on Me."
Yeah.
So I just wanted to let people know that, in case that shows up so often in American history, that if people don't know a lot about it, it might be a good chance to learn something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a question here about what happened to the Amal movement. Did Hezbollah subsume them? Hezbollah subsumed a lot of their militant factions. It didn't subsume a lot of their political factions. The Amal still remains a political force in Lebanon. They have seats in the legislature. That said, Hezbollah is a much larger portion of the Shiite representation in Lebanon. And Amal's political policies tend to be a little bit more left-wing economically than Hezbollah's tend to be. Hezbollah tends to be conservative on economics and on religion, for want of a better term. So that's sort of the difference. Amal sort of started its argument from, we represent the downtrodden peoples. It just happens that at this point that we are Shiites and we are downtrodden, but Amal had a more ecumenical approach from the onset. Hezbollah had to learn a more ecumenical approach, because in Iran is 90% Shiite, and remember, Hezbollah is an import from Iran. So when they came to Lebanon, they actually had to learn how to interact with non-Muslim groups, especially, so what they ended up learning pretty well, and they were able to do that by the creation of educational institutions and other things like that. But by and large, they sort of appeal to different constituencies. Another sort of thing that you have to take into account is the Lebanese voting system, which is one of the most Byzantine voting systems I've ever seen in a country where votes actually matter, as opposed to something like Saddam's Iraq, where like your vote doesn't matter. In any particular district, you vote for a number of different representatives. So let's say that there's a district with a certain population, they get 5 representatives in that district. But it's not that you get 5 representatives, end of sentence. You get 5 representatives. One of them has to be a Shiite, one of them has to be a Maronite, one of them has to be an Armenian, one of them has to be a Melkite, one of them has to be a Druze, and that's your 5. Well, what happens if you live in a neighborhood and there's like 3 Druze in that neighborhood? Well, one of them is going to be your representative. So a lot of these movements manage to get elected because they have placed individuals from their movement in the electoral region, and they've campaigned enough for people to be generally aware of it, and that way they come to power. So you have a very strong calcification of the people who will be deputies in the parliament, specifically for that, and because of all these clans, these Zaim that we keep talking about, which is why, if you turn on the news, you'll hear many of the same last names that I've been saying all throughout this presentation today, despite it being 40, 50 years later. You'll hear about Junblatz from the Druze side. You'll hear about Gemayels and Farangias and Suleimans and Shihabs from the Maronite side. You'll hear about you'll hear about Assols from the Sunni side. So you have a lot of these sort of people recycled. I actually wanted to ask Aaron if you're in a good position, if there's a comment that you want to make about the Lebanese Civil War that you felt like maybe I didn't address, or might be interesting from a military perspective.
All right. Sorry about that. Do you hear me?
We hear you.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, you know, by the way, you did a phenomenal job today on this topic, because I think very few people ever sort of incrementally break this down into all these constituent parts, and you get to see kind of this lattice of all the pieces, all the moving pieces. And so when people sort of over essentialize or simplify, why can't they sign a peace deal? Why can't they do this? Why can't they do that? Well, because you have this, ethno-religious, national, kinship-based matrix that, in essence, can't be. If you guys remember, for those of you old enough, that used to have those VCR tape rewinders, or cassette rewinders, or you could push in and it can rewind the cassette all the way back. Like, you can't rewind all the way back. And so you're forced to have to come to terms, right? It's very much like a national reconciliation, like you see with large scale civil war or guerrilla movements like the FARC and the Colombian government. And that takes, it took them 45 years, 50 years, right? And that was just two large movements, really. You could say the government swung back and forth between two different sides in Colombia, but basically, so 2.5. And in a place like Lebanon, I mean, like, how many sides are there? Like, does anyone have a map? Like, you'd have to put a cluster circle of all the sides, and what would be their incentives, in essence. So I think that's one thing you're really doing a phenomenal job, is sort of telling the story of all these constituent parts. One thing about the Lebanese Civil War that I don't think we really remember much anymore, but it was at full throttle, for those of us old enough to remember, in the 80s and into the 90s, as it was sort of, you got some of the vapor from, was just how much of a almost arms bazaar Lebanon was turned into. It was almost like an armed ammo depot, very much like Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine's substantially larger, and the scale of the conventional fight is just infinitely larger. But it's the same sort of ingredients in terms of the volume of arms and weaponry, and it leaked like a sleeve, right? I mean, all the parties fed that, and which then forced sort of a balance of power right? You couldn't be the, you couldn't be the naive sucker that was saying, oh, well, we're gonna do the peace phase of this for a couple of years and disarm. I mean, you would be run over. So there's a dimension there that forced, really in some ways, the social cultural fabric to just be this continuously escalating.
Yeah, it's basically a reverse cartel situation, right? Because
right.
you can't be the one person who declares peace.
No, it's
Everybody has to
impossible.
declare peace.
And that's impossible to negotiate, especially with all the proxy partners, right? Because that's, I think, one thing that's truly forgotten is the scale of the proxy partners through the Cold War and then the post-Cold War period. I mean, you could argue the end of the Civil War was sort of a strange indirect party to the end of the Soviet Union. I
think that's accurate.
Yeah, it wasn't direct, but it was sort of indirect. But you could argue they were going to run out of. Well, some of it is you run out of steam because you run out of humans at a certain point that are as kinetically committed as they were when you started. It's almost like if you model, like when they model the Hatfield McCoys, by the time you got to that like fifth, sixth generation, you still had people doing some pretty terrible things to each other, but the volume of people, right? It wasn't 100% of them, right? It was, 5, 10, 15%. So in some ways, I think that was going to happen over time anyways. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think it sort of accelerated the priorities of some of the proxies, right? So they had to make other business decisions, basically.
Yeah.
And but I would say one of the challenges that was instantiated then is that the long-term proxies were anchored, and so the sort of Iranian Syrian nexus, the Israeli Turkish nexus, like there's these nexuses there, the Egyptian, Israeli, Turkish, sometimes nexus. I mean, it's like all these, and you could argue the newer nexuses are the Gulf. I mean, the Gulf was involved then too, but it was sort of almost drive-by, opportunistic. And I think in the modern era, obviously, because the GCC is a 2 trillion plus GDP, regional power. So there's just economics now that just puts them in play every day. I do think one of the pieces that looks linear but was never linear was just the evolution of the major proxy combatants. It's not obvious that Islamic Jihad was going to be Islamic Jihad in the way it became Islamic Jihad and sort of a dominant player, because you could name 5 others that sound silly by today's standards because we forgot them and they've sort of petered out. So I do think that's something that is important to recognize, is that in some ways, the large proxy providers were sort of throwing mud against the wall to find proxies that could fit and scale. And when they did, then they threw the kitchen sink behind them and pushed them as far as they could, to the point that they, in essence, constructed their cadre. And you could argue, but then they all ran the same course where the cadre was smart. So then the cadre said thanks at some point, whether it took 5, 10, 15 years. And now you could argue it's the tail wagging, the dog, or the head. I forgot how you put that, but the tail wagging, instead of what is it? The head. What's that saying? God, I'm totally backwards right now.
All right. There's actually a question here about what faction of the Maronites does Michel Aoun represent. It's sort of complicated, and we're going to discuss it a lot more next week. But the situation is that after the Taif Agreement, which was the agreement that ended the Civil War in 1990, you had a number of Maronites that sort of took a page out of Shihab's book, right? Fuad Shahab, we saw tonight, was this idea, had this idea that despite the presidency being Maronite and despite the presidency having an incredibly broad range of powers, it was more effective to be coalition sharing and try and give the Muslims something to do, so they're not, stomping at the door to say that they don't have equality, regardless of how accurate or inaccurate that is, right? That you should have sort of an arrangement with Muslim leaders that you can trust and you can create a coalition with. And so that's sort of where Michel Aoun is coming from. He's coming from the faction of Maronites that want to reach out to Hezbollah and a number of the other groups that could function as that sort of Muslim ballast to keep him in power. And this contrasts with the Hariris, right, who are sort of more West-leaning. That's sort of the political shift that occurs in Lebanon post-Taif agreement, is that because Muslims are now equal, half the parliament is Muslim, half the parliament is Christian, and although the presidency still has a lot of powers, you need to work with Muslims more, so the Shihhabist thought process becomes dominant just by proxy. And so that's what Michel Aoun is doing. It's not the same kind of rah Christian all the way that we see from the Phalange, right? The Phalange is much more right wing among Maronite constituencies. So again, this is sort of, and it was sort of the point that Aaron was bringing up earlier, is that none of these groups is monolithic, and these groups all have very strong internal dissensions, which lead to their own lattice formation, I guess you could say, that looks less like all the Maronites stand here, all the Sunnis stand here, all the Shiites stand here, and it looks more like this coalition of Maronites and Shiites is standing here against this coalition of Maronites and Sunnis. I think that sort of covers it. Is there anybody else that has a question or who wants to say something? All right. So I guess with that, thank you for all of the kind comments. I really appreciate all the nice things that you've said. And I will see everybody next week when we finish Lebanon. All right. Bye.